The day Sallie Doyle stepped off the stagecoach in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1878, the entire town seemed to hold its breath, as if the dry desert wind itself had paused to take notice of the woman who had traveled 800 miles to marry a man she had never met. She was 23 years old, with dark auburn hair pinned beneath a travel-worn bonnet, green eyes sharp enough to cut glass, and a stubbornness written so plainly into the set of her jaw that even the horses tied outside the saloon seemed to sense it. She carried one leather trunk, a small Bible that had belonged to her mother, and a letter from a man named Gerald Hodge, who had paid for her passage west through a mail-order arrangement brokered by a matchmaking service out of St. Louis. The letter described Gerald Hodge as a prosperous rancher, kind in temperament, and eager for a wife who could manage a household. What the letter had not mentioned was that Gerald Hodge had been dead for 3 weeks. Sallie stood in the middle of the main street, the red dust settling around the hem of her skirts, the sun beating down with a ferocity she had never experienced in her native Ohio, and she read the expression on the face of the postmaster who had come to greet her. He was a small, nervous man named Clyde Burrows, and he twisted his hat between his hands with the energy of someone preparing to deliver very bad news. "Miss Doyle," he said, clearing his throat twice before continuing, "I am afraid there has been a development regarding Mr. Hodge that you were not informed of in time." Sallie looked at him steadily. "He is dead," Clyde blinked. "How did you?" "You are standing there like a man who has seen a ghost, Mr. Burrows, and the only ghost relevant to my current circumstances would be Gerald Hodge." She looked down the street at the row of storefronts, the mercantile, the barber shop, a doctor's office, and the saloon with its swinging doors. "What happened to him?" "His heart," the doctor said. "He went peacefully in his sleep." Clyde paused. He had no family to notify the agency in time. Sallie took one long breath and let it out slowly. She had left behind a life in Dayton that had offered her exactly nothing. Her parents were gone. Her older brother had married a woman who made it very clear that Sallie's presence in their small house was a burden, and the factory work she had been doing for 2 years had left her hands rough and her lungs perpetually dusted with cotton fiber. She had answered Gerald Hodge's advertisement not out of romance or longing, but out of the sheer practical necessity of building something that was hers. And now the foundation she had been promised was gone before she had even arrived to lay a single stone. "Is there a boarding house in town?" she asked. Clyde nodded, visibly relieved that she had not dissolved into tears. "Mrs. Potts runs one at the end of the street. Clean rooms, meals included." "How much?" "50 cents a week." Sallie did the arithmetic quickly in her head. She had $11.30 to her name. "I will need to find work," she said, not to Clyde particularly, but to the town itself, as though she were making a declaration to the dust and the heat and the wide blue Texas sky. She picked up her trunk, declined Clyde's offer to carry it for her, and walked the length of Redemption Creek's main street with her head up. It was during that walk, as she passed the livery stable, that she first saw Walter Fletcher. He was leading a tall roan horse out of the stable's open door, talking quietly to the animal in a low, steady voice, and he was so entirely absorbed in the task that he did not immediately notice Sallie. She noticed him, though, in the way that a person notices something that is unexpectedly beautiful in an otherwise harsh landscape. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing the kind of well-worn clothes that spoke of a man who worked outdoors and worked hard. His hat was pushed back on his head, and his face was lean and tanned, with dark eyes set beneath straight brows, and a jaw that carried several days of stubble. He looked to be somewhere around 27 or 28 years old. The roan horse chose that moment to sidestep abruptly, and Walter stepped back with it, nearly colliding with Sallie, who was forced to drop her trunk in order to avoid being stepped on. "Whoa!" He caught the horse, steadied it, and turned to find Sallie Doyle standing 2 feet away, looking down at her trunk in the dirt and then back up at him, with an expression that clearly communicated that this was not the first inconvenience this day had thrown at her, and it would not break her either. "I beg your pardon," he said immediately, and there was a genuine quality to it, not the casual dismissal she had received from men all her life who said sorry the way they might say nothing at all. He moved the horse aside and bent to pick up her trunk before she could reach it. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," Sallie said, "and I can carry my own trunk, thank you." He looked at her for a moment, taking in the travel-worn state of her clothes, the bonnet, the composure she wore like armor. "You just came off the stage." "Yes. You are Miss Doyle." It was not a question. She looked at him more carefully. "You know my name. Word travels fast in a town this size," he said. "I heard Clyde Burrows talking to the farrier this morning about meeting you." He set her trunk down gently rather than handing it back, which she found either presumptuous or courteous, and she had not yet decided which. "I am sorry about Gerald Hodge. He was a decent man." "Did you know him well?" "Well enough. He ran cattle east of town. I run a ranch to the north." He extended his hand. "Walter Fletcher." She shook it. His grip was firm but careful, as though he was conscious of his own strength. "Sallie Doyle." "Where are you headed, Miss Doyle?" "Mrs. Potts's boarding house, apparently." He picked up her trunk again, and this time when she opened her mouth to protest, he said mildly, "It is a heavy trunk and you have been traveling since before dawn, if the stage schedule holds. You can reclaim your independence once you have had something to eat." She found, to her slight annoyance, that she did not have a good argument against that particular logic, and so she allowed it. They walked the last 50 yards to the boarding house together, and in those 50 yards Sallie Doyle learned that Walter Fletcher had come to Redemption Creek 4 years ago from Tennessee, that he ran about 200 head of cattle on a spread he had built largely by himself, and that he had a horse named Scout who was, in his opinion, the most intelligent animal in Haskell County. "High praise," Sallie said. "Well earned," he replied, with the ghost of something that was not quite a smile but was heading in that direction. He carried her trunk up the steps of the boarding house, set it down on the porch, touched the brim of his hat and said, "I hope Redemption Creek treats you better than it has so far, Miss Doyle." She watched him walk back down the street toward the livery, and thought that Texas was very strange and very hot and possibly not entirely terrible. Mrs. Potts was a stout woman of 60 with silver hair and a kindness that expressed itself in the form of enormous meals, which Sallie was deeply grateful for. Over chicken stew and cornbread that first evening, Sallie laid out her situation plainly. She was stranded in a town where she knew no one, had no prospects, and needed to earn her keep. Mrs. Potts listened to all of this with her chin in her hand and then said, "Can you cook?" "Better than most." "Can you keep accounts?" "I kept the accounts for my brother's dry goods shop for 2 years, which was true, though her brother had never thanked her for it. Mrs. Potts nodded slowly. "Hank Dewey over at the Mercantile has been looking for someone to help manage his books and the store counter since his wife took ill. I can send you over in the morning." Sallie looked at this woman she had known for 4 hours and felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled very tight for a very long time. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. Hank is a difficult man before noon." He was, in fact, difficult before noon and somewhat difficult after noon as well, but Sallie had dealt with difficult men before, and she understood that what looked like difficulty was often just the brittle casing of someone who was overwhelmed. Hank Dewey was 55, perpetually behind on his ledgers, and possessed of a sharp tongue that softened considerably once he understood that Sallie Doyle was not going to wilt under it. She started work on her 3rd day in Redemption Creek, and within a week she had reorganized his account books, identified a supplier who had been overcharging him by nearly 15%, and charmed 3 of his regular customers into settling debts they had been carrying for months. Hank Dewey raised her wages without being asked. In a town of roughly 300 people, Sallie's arrival and her circumstances were known to everyone within days, as Clyde Burrows had proved himself a thorough broadcaster of news. She was introduced to the blacksmith, the doctor, the preacher and his wife, the schoolteacher and the owner of the saloon, a sharp-eyed woman named Mee Colton who ran her establishment with a combination of firm authority and warm humor that Sallie found unexpectedly admirable. And she kept encountering Walter Fletcher. This was, in a town of 300 people, not surprising. He came into the mercantile to buy feed and supplies twice a week. He ate Sunday meals at Mrs. Potts's boarding house, along with 4 or 5 other regular boarders. He was, Sallie gradually understood, a person whom the entire town seemed to trust, the kind of man who was called on when a fence needed mending or when 2 neighbors had a dispute that required a level head to settle. He was not loud or showy about any of it. He simply showed up when things needed doing and got them done. She liked that about him, though she was careful not to examine how much she liked it. Their conversations in those first weeks were practical and measured. The price of beef. The quality of the spring grazing. Whether the hardware shipment Hank was expecting from San Antonio would arrive before the summer heat made trail conditions difficult. They talked about books once, when Sallie mentioned she had brought 3 novels in her trunk, and Walter mentioned with some diffidence that he had a collection of Shakespeare that he had been carrying around since Tennessee, a fact she found both surprising and interesting. "A cattle rancher who reads Shakespeare," she said. "A mail-order bride who keeps ledgers," he replied, and then looked immediately as though he regretted the phrasing. But Sallie smiled because it was accurate and she had no interest in pretending otherwise. "Touché, Mr. Fletcher," he relaxed. "Walter, please. Then I am Sallie." The shift from formal address to first names was small, but it felt significant, like a door opened just a crack to let in light. It was in the 4th week of May that things changed between them, not with any dramatic declaration, but with a night that neither of them had planned. A group of riders had come through from the south, trailing a herd of longhorns bound for the rail yards in Abilene. They made camp outside of town, and most of them ended up at Mee Colton's saloon by nightfall. There was drinking, and then there was the kind of trouble that drinking among trail-worn men often produced, and by 9 o'clock the sheriff, a capable man named Amos Reardon, had his hands full. Sallie had been walking back from delivering a corrected invoice to a customer on behalf of the mercantile when the trouble spilled out of the saloon and into the street. 2 of the drovers were involved in something that was heading from argument toward violence, and a small crowd had gathered with the particular fascination of people who are not in danger but are watching those who might be. Walter was already there when Sallie arrived at the edge of the crowd. He was not watching from the edge. He was in the middle of it, not fighting, but standing between the 2 men with a quality of calm authority that was extraordinary to witness. He was speaking to them in a low, even voice, and his body was positioned with the relaxed readiness of a man who was not afraid of what might happen next but was very clear about what he intended to prevent. "You are both too far from home to spend a night in Amos Reardon's jail," he said to the 2 drovers, "and the cattle you are driving will not wait for court dates, so why don't you 2 decide what actually matters here and what does not?" There was a tense moment. Then the taller of the 2 men let out a long breath and stepped back, and the other one followed his lead, and the tension dropped out of the air like a deflated bladder. Sheriff Reardon appeared, took one look at the situation, and shook Walter's hand without saying anything. The crowd dispersed. Sallie was still standing at the edge of it when Walter turned and found her there. He looked briefly surprised to see her, and then he looked at her expression, which was thoughtful and perhaps a little too readable. "You handled that very well," she said. "Got lucky," he said. "Those men were tired enough that backing down felt better than going forward. That is not luck. That is knowing people." He looked at her steadily for a moment. The street was emptying around them, and the last light of the evening was turning the dust in the air a deep amber gold. "Are you heading back to Mrs. Potts?" "I am. May I walk with you?" "You may." They walked, and it was different from the first time he had walked with her. There was something looser in it, something more honest. He asked her about Ohio, and she told him, really told him, not the polished version but the actual version, about her parents dying within a year of each other when she was 19, about her brother's house where she had never been welcome, about the factory work and the way it had made her feel like she was disappearing. "Why west?" he asked. "Because east had nothing left in it for me," she said. "And because I had read enough to know that here, at least, a person could build something from the ground up if they were willing to work." "That is true," he said. "I know that from experience." She looked at him. "What were you leaving behind in Tennessee?" He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "A family that had strong opinions about what my life should look like, and a war that had torn apart everything I had grown up knowing." His voice was level, but there was something underneath it that spoke of old grief. The war between the states had ended 13 years ago, but it had left marks on a generation of men that did not fade easily. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it simply, without the performance of sympathy. "I am here now," he said, with a quietness that was not resignation but something more like peace. "This land is hard and it does not forgive mistakes easily, but it is honest. I value that." Sallie thought about that. "I value that too," she said. They reached the boarding house steps and stood for a moment in the warm dark. The stars above West Texas were enormous, more stars than she had ever seen in Ohio, a whole overwhelming universe spread overhead that made her feel simultaneously very small and very alive. "Thank you for walking with me," she said. "Thank you for your company," he said. He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture she was beginning to recognize as specifically his, and turned back toward the street. She stood on the porch and watched him go and felt something that she had not felt in a long time, something tentative and new and a little frightening, like a fire catching in a hearth that had been cold for years. The following weeks deepened what was growing between them with a naturalness that Sallie found both wonderful and strange, because she had not expected it, had not come to Texas looking for it, and found herself uncertain how to handle something she had no precedent for. He began stopping by the mercantile, not always for supplies. Sometimes he would come in and stand at the counter and talk to her about whatever had happened that morning on the ranch, a calf born during the night, a problem with a fence line, and she would listen and respond, and they would talk until Hank Dewey made pointed noises about customers needing assistance. Walter would buy something he did not particularly need, tip his hat to Hank, and leave, and Sallie would be distracted for the rest of the morning. She began to look forward to Sundays at Mrs. Potts's table with a specific anticipation she was trying not to examine too closely. Mrs. Potts, who missed nothing, said to her one evening with perfect casualness, "Walter Fletcher is a fine man." "He is," Sallie agreed neutrally. "Not much for socializing as a rule, more talkative lately." Sallie did not answer that. Mrs. Potts smiled into her sewing. "Just an observation." In early June, Walter asked if she would like to see the ranch. He phrased it carefully, noting that she had mentioned an interest in how cattle operations worked, which was true. She had said so in the context of understanding the economic landscape of the region, a perfectly practical observation. He said he would bring a horse from the livery for her, that the ride was about 5 miles north, and that he could have her back in town before dark. She said yes, and then spent the following morning pretending she was not thinking about it. The morning of the ride was clear and brilliant, the sky that particular shade of Texas blue that she had come to think of as belonging specifically to this place. Walter brought a gentle gray mare named Pearl for her to ride, alongside Scout, and they rode north out of town through grassland that shifted and rolled in the warm wind, dotted with wildflowers and crossed by shallow creeks that caught the sunlight. Sallie had ridden before, growing up in Ohio, and she settled comfortably into the saddle, and the ease of it seemed to surprise him pleasantly. They rode side by side and talked easily, about everything and nothing, about the history of the land, about the communities of ranchers in the area, about a family named the Hendersons who had a homestead 3 miles east of Walter's ranch and who had come from Germany 6 years ago, and were making it work with a determination that impressed everyone who knew them. "Mr. Henderson came here with $40, 6 children and almost no English, Walter said. Now he has 200 acres under cultivation and those children speak better English than half the people in Redemption Creek. Good people make good lives, Sallie said, with enough room to do it. That is the promise of this place, he said. The problem is that the promise is not distributed evenly. She looked at him. No, she said, it is not. She was thinking of what she had heard from me Colton about the Apache people who had once moved freely across this land. The Comanche who had been forced from territories that had been theirs for centuries. Walter had spoken about it before, briefly, with a bluntness that she appreciated, acknowledging the weight of what the westward movement had cost people who had called these plains home long before anyone else. He did not dress it up or make excuses for it, and she found that honesty more valuable than the comfortable silence most people kept around the subject. The ranch itself was modest by some standards and impressive by others. The main house was a solid stone and timber structure with a wide porch, built to last, built with intention. There were 2 bunkhouses for the 3 hands he employed, a well-constructed barn, corrals where a portion of his herd was penned, and a kitchen garden to one side of the house that was, she noticed, somewhat neglected. "You are not much of a gardener," she said. He looked at the garden with the expression of a man confronting a known weakness. "I keep meaning to give it more attention." "What is in it?" "Theoretically, tomatoes, squash, and beans. In practice, mostly weeds and regret." She laughed genuinely, and the sound surprised both of them. He looked at her with an expression she had trouble reading, something warm and careful at once. "I like to hear you laugh," he said, and then seemed to consider whether he had said too much. She did not look away from him. "I do not do it often enough," she said honestly. They walked through the barn while he showed her the horses, 6 altogether, and she stopped at a bay gelding near the far end and let him nose at her hand and spoke to him softly, and Walter watched her with an attention she could feel without looking at it directly. Over the simple lunch that one of his hands had left prepared in the kitchen, corn bread and salt pork, and the last of a pot of coffee, they sat across from each other at the plain wooden table and talked for what felt like a very short time and was actually 2 hours. He told her more about the ranch, about the plans he had for expanding his herd, about a particular water source he had been working to develop on the north pasture. She told him about the improvements she had suggested to Hank Dewey that had already begun to increase the mercantile's profitability. He listened to her with his full attention, with the particular quality of a man who not only heard but considered what was said, and she found it intoxicating in a way she had not expected from a conversation about business logistics. "You are wasted on a mercantile counter," he said. "Perhaps," she said, "but for now it is what I have and I am grateful for it." He looked at her for a moment with that careful, warm expression she was beginning to catalog and treasure. "What do you want, Sallie? Not what you have or what you are managing with. What do you actually want?" The question was simple and direct, and it went through her like a clear note struck on a bell. She had been asked many things in her life, but almost no one had ever asked her that. She thought about it honestly, looking out through the kitchen window at the rolling grassland and the enormous sky. "A place that is mine," she said finally. "Not borrowed and not permitted. Mine, with work I find meaningful and people I trust around me." She paused, "and perhaps eventually a garden that actually grows things." He was quiet for a beat and then he said, very quietly, "That seems like a reasonable thing to want." On the ride back to town, the afternoon light turned golden and long, and they rode close enough that their horses' shoulders occasionally touched, and neither of them moved apart when it happened. He helped her down from Pearl at the livery, his hands at her waist for just a moment before she found the ground, and the closeness of it, the brief warmth of his hands, the way he looked at her when she was level with the ground again, said something that neither of them had yet said in words, but both of them, she was quite sure, had heard. "Thank you," she said, "for today." "Thank you for coming," he said. "I have been wanting to show you the place." "You have." "For some time," he admitted, with a directness that made her breath catch slightly. She walked back to the boarding house in the long evening light, and the feeling in her chest was no longer tentative. It was fully alive, warm and certain, and it frightened her exactly as much as it delighted her. Summer settled over Redemption Creek with a heat that was almost physical in its weight, a dry, pressing heat that made the air shimmer above the hard-packed earth and drove people to shade in the long afternoon hours. Sallie learned to adapt, as she had adapted to everything else, adjusting her schedule to the rhythms of the season, working the coolest hours of early morning and late afternoon, and spending the midday in the relative shade of the Mercantile. She had been in Redemption Creek for nearly 3 months when the situation with Harlan Cross arrived like a thunderstorm that had been building on the horizon for weeks. Harlan Cross was a rancher to the east, the kind of man who had come west early and claimed land with a broad confidence that what he could see was his by right of having seen it first. He ran a large operation and employed a number of men whose loyalty he purchased with high wages and a willingness to look the other way. He was not violent precisely, but he operated in the space adjacent to violence, applying pressure to smaller landowners and homesteaders in ways that were just short of actionable. It was the Henderson family who fell into his sights first that summer. Old Gunter Henderson had water rights to a creek that ran through his eastern boundary, rights that had been legally established 4 years earlier, and those rights happened to be deeply inconvenient to Harlan Cross's expansion plans. Cross began sending his men to interfere with Henderson's irrigation, small acts of sabotage that were difficult to prove, combined with an offer to buy Gunter out at a price well below the land's actual value. Sallie learned about this from Gunter's eldest daughter, Else, who was 18 and worked part-time at the Mercantile. Else came in one morning with the kind of fear behind her eyes that people wear when they are trying not to show it. "My father will not sell," Else said. "But his men came again last night and broke the channel gate on the north side. Has Sheriff Reardon been told?" "Yes, but Mr. Cross's men have witnesses who say they were nowhere near our land." Else's jaw tightened. It is not a fair fight. Sallie thought about this for the rest of the morning. At noon she walked to the sheriff's office, where she found Walter already in conversation with Amos Reardon. She had not known he would be there, but she was not surprised. This was exactly the kind of thing he showed up for. She sat down uninvited in the spare chair and laid out what Else had told her with the precision of someone presenting a legal brief. Both men listened without interrupting. When she was finished, Walter said to Reardon, "She is right that the witnesses are the problem. But if there is a pattern of incidents we can document, and I have heard of at least 4, there is a case for harassment that goes beyond what any single incident could establish." "I can help document it," Sallie said. "I keep records, that is what I do. If the Henderson family will bring me every incident, dates, descriptions, damages, I can compile it into something a court could use." Reardon looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing a situation. "That would take time." "Then we should start immediately." It took 3 weeks. Sallie collected testimony from Gunter Henderson, his wife Maria, Else, and 2 neighboring homesteaders who had experienced similar pressure from Cross's operation. She compiled everything into a careful, chronological document that laid out a pattern of deliberate harassment, with the clarity of someone who understood that facts were most powerful when they were organized. Walter helped her cross-reference land records at the county courthouse in the next town, riding the 20 miles there and back in a single long day, returning with the documentation she needed to establish that Cross had been operating beyond his legal land boundaries in at least 2 cases. On the day she presented the completed document to Reardon, Walter was there, and he looked at what she had assembled with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that was not just respect but something deeper and more personal. "This is exceptional work," he said. "It is what was needed," she said. Reardon took the document to the county judge the following week. Harlan Cross received a formal legal injunction requiring him to cease the interfering activity and was assessed damages payable to the Henderson family. It was not a perfect outcome, and it did not make Cross harmless, but it established boundaries he could no longer ignore without serious legal consequences. Gunter Henderson came into the mercantile 3 days after the ruling and stood in front of the counter with his hat in his hands and his eyes bright. "Miss Doyle," he said, in his accented English that was better than he gave himself credit for, "my family would not have this victory without you. We are in your debt." "You are in no one's debt," Sallie said firmly but warmly. "You had the right of it from the beginning. I only helped make that visible." Gunter nodded, his expression still full, and left. When she turned around, Walter was in the doorway of the mercantile, having come in while Gunter was speaking. He had clearly heard all of it. He looked at her with the full weight of what had been building between them for months, undisguised and clear, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Have dinner with me." Not as a practical arrangement. The way he said it made clear that this was something else entirely. "Yes," she said. They had dinner at the small hotel restaurant that was the closest thing Redemption Creek had to a formal dining establishment, a room with 6 tables and oil lamps and a cook who could produce a creditable beef roast. It was not elegant, but it was quiet and warm, and they sat across from each other for 3 hours, and the food was secondary to everything else. He told her things he had not told her before, about the farm in Tennessee where he had grown up, about his 2 younger brothers whom the war had taken, about the particular grief of coming through something that cost so many people around you everything, while you yourself survived with both your life and your guilt intact. He spoke about it plainly, without performance, and she heard the weight of it and did not try to lighten it with easy comfort. "You did not choose to survive," she said quietly. "No," he said, "but I have spent a long time trying to be worth it." She looked at him across the lamplit table. "I think you are," she said. He was quiet for a moment, absorbing that. Then he said, "Tell me something you have never told anyone." She considered this. "I am not afraid of being alone," she said, "but I have been afraid that alone was all there was for me, that the kind of partnership I wanted, true and honest and equal, was something that existed in books and not in life." She paused. "I am beginning to think I was wrong about that." He held her gaze with a steadiness that felt like a promise. "You were wrong about that," he said. Walking back from the hotel in the warm summer dark, their arms brushed together and neither of them moved apart. And when they reached the boarding house steps, he stopped and turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and the moment between them was full of everything they had been building since that first day in the dust outside the livery stable. "Sallie," he said. "Walter," she said, and she heard the smile in her own voice, and she saw it answer in his face. He reached up and took her hand, very gently, and held it between both of his, and the warmth of that simple contact moved through her like the first note of a song she had been waiting to hear. "I do not want to move faster than is comfortable for you," he said carefully. "You came here in difficult circumstances, and you have been building your life from the ground up. I do not want to complicate that." "You are not complicating it," she said. "You are part of it." And she meant that in a way that surprised her with its certainty, because she had not expected to mean anything quite so definitively this early in her life here. But there it was, plain and honest and true. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture so careful and so warm that she felt it all through her, and looked up at her with dark eyes that were the opposite of opaque. "Good night, Sallie," he said. "Good night, Walter," she said. She went inside and stood in the hallway for a moment with her hand still warm from his and her heart doing something that she could not quite describe but that felt entirely correct. Mrs. Potts was in the parlor, which could be seen from the hallway, and she looked up from her knitting with an expression of complete unsurprise. "Good evening," she said mildly. "Good evening," said Sallie, with dignity that she was fairly sure was not fully convincing. The courtship, if that was the right word for something that had been building since the day they nearly collided outside the livery stable, continued through July and August with a warmth and depth that Sallie had not known she was capable of receiving. Walter was not a man who expressed himself in flourishes or dramatic gestures. He expressed himself in presence and attention, and the kind of consistent care that meant more to Sallie, whose life had been notably short on consistent care, than any theatrical declaration could have. He brought her wildflowers on an entirely ordinary Tuesday, holding them out with an expression that was both hopeful and slightly uncertain, which was the most endearing thing she had ever seen on a fully capable adult man. She put them in a glass of water on the mercantile counter, and they brightened the room for a week. He helped her fix a problem with her boarding house window latch that had been sticking all summer, appearing one morning with his tools and having it resolved in 20 minutes without being asked, because she had mentioned it once in passing and he had listened. On Sunday afternoons, when the heat was at its most insistent, they began a habit of sitting together in the shade of the large oak tree behind Mrs. Potts's garden, he with his Shakespeare and she with whatever novel was next in her trunk, reading in companionable quiet that said more about their comfort with each other than any conversation could have. He read to her once from the Henry plays, a passage he particularly liked, and she listened with her eyes closed and the warm air moving through the grass, and when he stopped she said, "That is beautiful." "I have always thought so," he said. She opened her eyes and found him looking at her rather than the page. "Reading," she said softly. He kept reading. In August, Me Colton had a party at the saloon to celebrate the anniversary of Redemption Creek's founding, a gathering that was inclusive enough to include most of the town, women and children and all, with the alcohol content adjusted accordingly for the occasion. There was music, a fiddle player and a man with an accordion who between them produced a lively and irresistible sound, and there was dancing on the cleared floor. Sallie had not danced in years. She had forgotten how much she loved it. Walter asked her with the formality of a man who had perhaps practiced the asking, and she gave him her hand and they found the rhythm together with surprising ease, his hand warm and sure at her waist, her hand on his shoulder feeling the solidity of him, turning together through the crowd with the music bright around them. He was a better dancer than his general manner had led her to expect, and she told him so. "My mother insisted," he said, with a slight flush of color under his tan. "She said a man who could not dance was only half civilized. Wise woman. She was," she heard the past tense. "How long ago?" 7 years. His expression briefly held the particular quality of grief for someone who was irreplaceable. "She would have liked you." Sallie looked at him steadily. "Why?" "Because you do not pretend." She had no patience for pretending either. He turned them gently through the music. "And because you are the most genuinely capable person I have met in a very long time, and she respected that above most things." The warmth that went through Sallie at those words was quiet and deep and lodged somewhere permanent. Later in the evening, when the music had slowed and the dancing had settled into the easier movement of people who were tired but not ready to stop, he held her a little closer and she allowed it, and they moved together slowly, and neither of them needed to say anything about what this was. It was the last day of August when Walter rode into town in the early morning with an expression that told her something had happened on the ranch, and she stepped out of the mercantile at the sound of Scout's hooves on the main street and knew before he reached her. "The North Pasture Creek has been diverted," he said. "Someone redirected the flow during the night. The cattle that were grazing there have no water source, and the summer has been dry enough that I cannot move them to an alternative without risking them on the trail." She thought immediately, "Cross. The direction it was diverted suggests his land, and I have no proof yet." His jaw was tight with controlled frustration. "I will pull the water rights documentation from the county courthouse filings I have on record," she said immediately. "Hank let me make copies of everything relevant during the Henderson situation. If the diversion touches the creek that runs through your north boundary, then you have legal standing." "I know I have legal standing. The problem is that it will take time and my cattle do not have time." She thought about the landscape around his ranch, which she knew from their rides together. "The Henderson property has a spring on its western side, does it not? About 2 miles from your north pasture boundary." He looked at her. "Yes. Gunter Henderson would let you water your cattle there. You know that." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through the logistics. I would need to negotiate a temporary right-of-way across the quarter-mile between his land and mine. Gunter Henderson would give you that in an hour if you asked, she said. You helped his family. He will not hesitate. He looked at her, and his expression shifted from tight frustration into something that was partly gratitude and partly the particular look that she was beginning to understand was what she did to him when she was simply herself. You are right, he said. Go to Gunter, she said. I will handle the documentation for Reardon. By the time your cattle are settled, we will have a formal complaint ready. He leaned forward in the saddle, and for a moment they were very close, his face at the level of hers, and there was a quick suspended moment in which the whole wide morning held still. Sally, he said. Go, she said, because she could feel the urgency of the situation even as she felt the pull of the moment. We will talk later. He held her gaze for one more second, and then he turned scout and rode hard back toward the northern road. Gunter gave the right-of-way without a second's hesitation, as she had known he would, and Sally had the formal complaint on Reardon's desk by late afternoon. The investigation into the diversion took 2 weeks, and it established that Cross's men had been responsible. Adding to the legal difficulties Cross was already managing from the Henderson situation. The cumulative weight of the complaints pushed him toward a settlement rather than further conflict. And by mid-September, the diverted creek had been restored, and Cross had agreed to legal boundaries that he was now strongly motivated to respect. It was the evening after the resolution was confirmed that Walter came to the boarding house for Sunday dinner, and when the meal was finished and the other boarders had wandered to their various rooms, and Mrs. Potts had made herself conspicuously busy in the back of the house, he and Sally sat together in the parlor in the quiet, and he said, I need to tell you something. She waited. I have been wanting to say this for some time, and I have been approaching it from a dozen different angles, and there is no angle that improves it, so I am just going to say it plainly. He looked at her with the steady dark eyes that she had been looking at for 4 months and learning to read like a language. I love you, Sally, not in a simple or a passing way, in a way that has changed how I see everything around me. The ranch, the town, the future I was planning before you arrived. He paused. I'm not asking anything of you right now except that you know it. The room was very quiet. The lamp on the side table cast a warm light over everything. Sally looked at him for a long moment. She thought about all the practical care and the Sunday reading and the wildflowers and the way he had listened to her, actually listened, for 4 months. She thought about the man who had stood between 2 angry drovers and spoken calmly. She thought about the way he had said his mother would have liked her, and the way he had held her while they danced. She thought about his face in the morning light when he was worried about his cattle, and her mind had immediately gone to the solution, because she had been paying attention to his land, and his life the way you pay attention to the things that matter to you. I love you too, she said simply. I have been trying to be careful about it because it frightened me a little, but it is true, and I am done being careful about it. He reached across and took her hand and held it with both of his, the way he had the night after their first dinner, and this time she turned her hand in his and interlaced her fingers with his fingers and felt the warm, solid reality of him. What would you like? He asked quietly. What does the future look like to you if you could shape it? She thought about the ranch, the wide grassland, the solid stone house with its neglected kitchen garden, the enormous sky. She thought about the work she loved and the person sitting beside her and the town that had become, against all her expectations, a place she was glad to be. A life, she said, a real one, together. She met his eyes, and I would very much like to do something about that kitchen garden. He looked at her and then he laughed, a full, genuine laugh, and she laughed with him. And in the small, warm parlor of Mrs. Potts's boarding house in Redemption Creek, Texas, in the year 1878, something that had been growing since a woman dropped a trunk in the dust outside a livery stable became the kind of thing that does not have to grow anymore because it has arrived. He proposed formally on a Saturday in October, down on one knee in the kitchen garden, with the first successful signs of the late-planted herbs coming through the soil around him, holding out a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that caught the Texas light and held it. Sallie said yes before he had finished the question, and she pulled him to his feet and into her arms, and the afternoon around them was warm and clear and entirely right. Mrs. Potts cried, which she categorically denied later. Hank Dewey shook Walter's hand and told Sallie she had the worst timing, since she was, in his words, irreplaceable, and then immediately agreed to help her find and train her replacement, because he was a better man than his gruffness suggested. Me Colton opened a bottle of good whiskey at the saloon in their honor, and the Hendersons brought a meal that fed 12 people and was the best Sallie had eaten since arriving in Texas. Clyde Burrows announced it to everyone within a 15-mile radius within approximately 6 hours. They were married on the second Saturday of November, 1878, in the church at the end of Redemption Creek's Main Street, with Reverend Halliday officiating and most of the town in attendance. Sallie wore a dress of deep green that she and Else Henderson had made together in the evenings over 3 weeks, a color that her auburn hair made into something vivid and beautiful, and she walked to the front of the church without anyone to give her away because she was giving herself, freely and by choice, which seemed to her the only honest way to do it. Walter was standing at the front of the church in a dark coat that she had never seen on him before, and when he saw her come through the door, he looked at her with an expression so open and unhidden that the entire congregation felt it, a warm ripple of recognition moving through the room. They made their vows in clear, direct voices, looking at each other steadily. When Reverend Halliday pronounced them married, and Walter kissed her gently in front of the whole assembled town, there was applause that was somewhat louder than strictly necessary, but entirely warranted. The celebration afterward was held at Me Colton's, with the fiddle and accordion and dancing that went on until the November sky was fully black and salted with stars. Walter danced with Sallie until her feet ached, and she did not stop. Gunter Henderson performed a German song in a baritone that nobody had suspected he possessed, which brought down the house. Mrs. Potts danced with Sheriff Reardon and maintained afterward that it was simply courtesy. Else Henderson caught Sallie privately near the end of the evening, her young face bright and emotional. "You are the finest woman I know," she said, with the directness of someone who has not yet learned to soften their best sentiments. "I am so glad you came here." Sallie held the girl's hands and felt a wave of something that was not quite maternal but was something in that direction, the particular feeling of being glad about a person and their future. "So am I," she said honestly. "So am I." She and Walter rode out to the ranch that night, beneath the stars, his arm around her as they sat together in the buggy he had borrowed for the occasion, the warm, solid weight of him against her side, and the night around them huge and quiet and their own. The ranch at night was different from the ranch in daylight, all deep shadow and silver where the moonlight caught it, and she stood on the porch for a moment looking out at the grassland and felt the strange and wonderful weight of this being hers, not permitted or borrowed but genuinely, truly hers. He came to stand beside her and put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together in the Texas dark without needing to say anything about it. "Welcome home," he said quietly. She leaned into him. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The first winter at the ranch was a revelation in practicalities." Sallie had understood intellectually that a cattle operation in West Texas required constant attention and hard work, but understanding something in theory and learning its daily reality were different things, and she threw herself into the learning with the same thoroughness she had brought to reorganizing Hank Dewey's ledgers. Walter had 3 ranch hands, Sam and Pete, 2 brothers from Arkansas, and a quiet, capable man named Domingo who had grown up in the area and knew the land better than anyone. Domingo's family had been in this part of Texas for generations, descendants of the original Spanish settlers, and his knowledge of the land's patterns, its water sources and weather signs and seasonal movements, was encyclopedic and invaluable. Sallie made it her business to learn from him. She asked questions that were specific and practical, and Domingo, who was a man of few words but great patience with genuine curiosity, answered them in the same spirit. Within 2 months, she understood the northern pasture's drainage patterns better than she had understood the streets of Dayton, which struck her as entirely correct given the relative importance of the two things. She kept the ranch accounts with the same rigor she had brought to the mercantile, and within the first month had identified 3 areas where costs could be reduced without reducing the quality of the operation. She also identified an opportunity, a market for good beef in the growing town of Abilene that was currently being served by operations further east, and a route that could serve it more efficiently from Walter's location. She brought this to Walter one evening over the accounts book, laying out the numbers with characteristic directness. He looked at the figures, then at her, then back at the figures. "You are suggesting we expand the herd by 40 head and establish a direct contract with the Abilene buyers." "The numbers support it," she said. "They do," he agreed slowly. "This would be significant growth." "It is the right time," she said. "The spring grazing looks good and the cross situation has settled. The land to the north is available and the water rights are clear." He was quiet for a moment, the lamp between them casting warm light over the account pages. "You would have made an extraordinary businesswoman in any city in this country," he said. "I am an extraordinary businesswoman in this particular part of this particular state," she said pleasantly, and he grinned, which was the expression she most loved on him because it broke through his natural composure and showed the man underneath entirely. They expanded the herd in the spring of 1879. The Abilene contract was established in April, and it was, as her figures had predicted, highly profitable. Walter hired 2 more hands and began construction of a second barn. The kitchen garden was no longer neglected. It was producing tomatoes, squash, beans, peppers, and herbs in quantities that supplied the household through summer and into fall. Sallie had found, to her own surprise, that she loved the garden not as a chore but as a genuine pleasure, the quiet morning work of it, the satisfaction of things growing, the particular meditative quality of attending to living things. She kept a journal of what she planted, and when and what worked, and what did not, with the same methodical care she brought to everything. The town remained a constant part of their life. She continued to consult with Hank Dewey on occasion, and her replacement at the mercantile, a young woman named Rosalind who had recently arrived in town, turned out to be both capable and smart, and Sallie took quiet satisfaction in the fact that she had been instrumental in identifying and training her. She maintained her involvement in the community, helping with the school fundraising when the schoolteacher Mr. Abernathy needed new books, helping me Colton navigate a lease dispute with her landlord, keeping an eye on the legal and financial landscape of the community, with the habit of someone who understood that individual prosperity and community health were deeply connected. Else Henderson, who had finished the schooling available in Redemption Creek and was hungry for more, began coming to the ranch on Tuesdays for what Sallie called reading and conversation, and what was actually a structured program of learning covering literature, history, mathematics, and practical business knowledge. Else was a swift student, and Sallie felt a satisfaction in those Tuesday sessions that was pure and uncomplicated. "You should be a teacher," Else told her one afternoon, with the blunt admiration of someone who does not understand why the obvious thing is not already happening. "Perhaps eventually," Sallie said. "For now I have a ranch to help run and a garden to manage and several irons in the fire." Else looked at her with 17-year-old perspicacity. "You are also going to have a baby." Sallie looked up from the book she had set aside. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because you have been nauseous in the mornings for 2 weeks and you told Mrs. Potts you were feeling well when she asked, which is not how you usually answer questions." Else raised her eyebrows. "I am not unobservant." Sallie shook her head slowly and laughed. "No, you are certainly not." She had known for 9 days. She had not told Walter yet because she was still sitting with it, turning it over in her mind with the careful attention she gave to anything important. But that evening, after dinner, when they were sitting on the porch in the warm June evening with the last light on the grassland and the frogs starting up in the creek somewhere below, she put down her book and turned to him and told him. His face changed in a way she had not seen before, something so open and clean that it was like watching a door swing wide onto clear sky. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he reached over and took her hand, and his grip was steady and strong. "Are you all right?" He asked first because he was always that practical in his care. "I am very well," she said. "I was nauseous for a week and now I am not. Otherwise I feel quite normal." "Are you glad?" he asked with a carefully calibrated diffidence that she loved because it was him giving her space to feel whatever she felt without layering his own feelings on top of it first. "Yes," she said honestly. "Frightened a little, but yes." He raised her hand to his lips. "I am glad too," he said, and his voice was full. Their son was born in February of 1880, a robust, demanding, entirely healthy boy whom they named James Thomas Fletcher. James for no particular reason except that it suited him immediately, and Thomas for Walter's father. He arrived in the early hours of a cold morning with Dr. Mercer in attendance and Mrs. Potts present by firm personal necessity. And when Sallie held him for the first time, he looked up at her with dark eyes that were immediately and unmistakably his father's. And she felt a love that was entirely different in quality from anything she had felt before, huge and animal and specific, belonging entirely to this particular small person. Walter sat beside the bed with his elbows on his knees and looked at his son with the expression of a man who is confronting something that has permanently rearranged his understanding of what matters. "Hello, James," he said, quietly and solemnly, as though making a formal introduction. James Thomas Fletcher stared back at him with the serious expression of a newborn, and Sallie laughed and Walter looked at her exhausted, radiant face, and said, with the plain certainty that was his most characteristic mode, "You are extraordinary." She shook her head. "We did this together." "In unequal parts," he said. "Which is not something I will argue with right now," she said. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead with a gentleness that was enormous in its care, and she leaned into it. Mrs. Potts held James and told him in brisk, warm terms that he had come into good hands. Else Henderson, informed by a note delivered by Pete that same morning, arrived at the ranch by noon in a state of barely contained excitement that manifested in extremely efficient helpfulness, producing food and tidying everything within reach. Gunter Henderson sent a message that arrived the following day, written in careful English that Sallie kept, expressing congratulations and the hope that young James would grow up as determined as his mother and as steady as his father. James grew with the energy and appetite of someone in a hurry. He was crawling by the time spring returned, pulling himself upright against anything that would hold him, and walking before his first birthday with a lurching confidence that made his father laugh every time. He was dark-haired and dark-eyed and had Sallie's stubborn jaw, a combination that Walter said predicted an interesting future. Redemption Creek continued to grow in those years. New families arrived. The school expanded. A second doctor set up practice. The railroad was still some years away from coming through directly, but a stage line connection to the rail junction 20 miles south improved commerce substantially, and Walter's cattle operation benefited from the more reliable transport. The Abilene contract matured into a standing arrangement that provided stable income year on year. Harlan Cross, his operations constrained by the cumulative legal actions, eventually sold most of his land to a syndicate from back east and moved on. The land he left behind was, over the following years, taken up by smaller homesteading families who used it more carefully and more sustainably, and the community was quietly better for the change. On the evening of their second wedding anniversary, in November of 1880, Walter came inside from the last of the evening chores to find the table set with the good cloth and candles, and a meal that Sallie had been cooking since the afternoon, with what he recognized as serious intention. He washed up and sat down and looked across the table at his wife and his son in his high chair making earnest attempts on a piece of cornbread, and felt the specific fullness of a life that was not perfect, not easy, not without hard seasons and difficult days, but was deeply, genuinely good. "What are we celebrating?" he asked. "2 years," she said. "And the fact that your Abilene contract just renewed at 15% above the previous rate." She tilted her head slightly. "And one other thing." He looked at her with the attention he always gave her. She was smiling in the particular way she had smiled at him the morning she had told him about James, a smile that held something new and large and slightly frightening and entirely wonderful. "Another spring," he said. "Another February, I think," she said. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his and looked at her in the candlelight. This woman who had arrived in a dust cloud off a stagecoach with a leather trunk and $11, and the kind of capable, clear-eyed strength that he had recognized immediately and had spent 2 years being grateful for every single day. "I love you," he said. "I want you to know that I say it because it is the truest thing I know, not because occasions call for it." She turned her hand in his. "I know," she said. "I say it back for the same reason." James, finding their prolonged eye contact less interesting than his cornbread, made a noise of sufficient volume to redirect their attention, and they both looked at him and laughed, and the candlelight held the three of them in its warm circle, while the November wind moved outside across the Texas grassland. Their second child, a boy they named Robert Dale Fletcher, arrived in March of 1881, 2 weeks past his expected date, and in such a rush to make up for the delay that Dr. Mercer barely arrived in time. Robert was from the first a different creature from James, quieter and more observant, watching the world from very early with brown eyes that were his mother's shade, storing information with a patience that made Sallie think he was going to be a reader. James, who was just past his first birthday, regarded his new brother with the focused scrutiny of someone assessing a situation he had not been consulted about. He eventually reached out and patted Robert's head with an energy that required gentle management, and pronounced something that sounded encouragingly like approval. Having 2 small children and a growing cattle operation and a household to run, and a community she was embedded in was not simple, and Sallie had never expected it to be simple. The ranch had taken on an additional character with the children in it, noisier, more frequently chaotic, threaded through with a specific kind of joy that she had not fully anticipated and was now unwilling to imagine being without. Walter was present as a father in the way he was present in everything, thoroughly and with attention, and watching him with his sons, patient and playful and steady, was one of the things she loved most about their life. Else Henderson, who by the spring of 1881 was a young woman of 20 with a sharpness and capability that had outgrown everything available to her in Redemption Creek proper, made the announcement one Tuesday that she had applied to the Texas State Normal School in Huntsville, which had opened the previous year and was training teachers. Sallie, who had had considerable private correspondence with the school on Else's behalf without telling her, said, "I know. I wrote them a letter recommending you 3 months ago." Elle stared at her. "You will need to take an examination, which you will pass without difficulty," Sallie said. "And the cost of the first semester's room and board has been handled." "How?" Elle said carefully. "A small contribution from your parents, a somewhat larger contribution from Walter and me, and a scholarship the school offers to promising female students from rural areas that I discovered existed and took the liberty of applying for on your behalf." Sallie looked at her steadily. "You are going to be a teacher, Else. You know that. This is simply making it happen at the proper time." Else was quiet for a moment, and then her face did something very young and very moved before she pulled it together. "You cannot just arrange people's lives," she said, but her voice was thick. "I did not arrange it," Sallie said. "I cleared the path. You will do the walking." Els crossed the room and hugged her, with the uncomplicated physical warmth of someone who had been raised in a family where affection was straightforward, and Sallie held the young woman who had been her first friend in this place, and felt the warm satisfaction of watching someone excellent move toward their own proper life. Gunter Henderson came to the ranch the following Sunday. He sat at their kitchen table and ate Maria's apple cake that he had brought and looked at Sallie with a directness that was very much his daughter's. "What you have done for our Els," he said, "I do not have words for it." "She earned it," Sallie said, "everything she is earning." "Yes," he said, "but she needed someone to see it who could also do something about it. You did both." He shook his head slowly. "We came to this country with nothing. People told us we were foolish. Sometimes I believed them." He looked at the kitchen around him, at James playing on the floor with a set of wooden blocks Walter had made for him, at Robert asleep in his cradle in the corner. "There is injustice in this land that does not go away because we do not look at it. The Apache people whose land this was, the Comanche, the people who were here before any of us. I think about it." He paused. "But there is also this. What you and Walter have built, what Maria and I have built, what else will build." He looked back at Sallie. "It matters." "It does," she said. "And the other matters too. Both can be true." He nodded. "Yes, both can be true." They sat in the late afternoon quiet with that particular understanding between them, the weight of history and the reality of the present moment, the fact of injustice that required acknowledging and the daily act of building something good in the midst of it all. Walter came in from the barn and found them sitting and read the quality of the conversation correctly, and poured coffee for all three of them, and joined it without needing an explanation. By the fall of 1881, Redemption Creek was a different town from the one Sallie had stepped off the stage into 3 years before. It had grown to perhaps 450 people. The school had a full-time teacher and 32 students. The mercantile had expanded under Rosalind's capable management. A small newspaper had started up, published weekly, and Sallie had contributed 2 columns to it under her initials, one on water rights legislation, and one on the economics of small cattle operations, both of which had been reprinted in the San Antonio paper. Me Colton had, in the way of things that seem obvious in retrospect, married Sheriff Amos Reardon in the spring, in a ceremony that was modest in scale and enormous in general approval. They were, as Walter observed, exactly the partnership you would construct if you were designing one deliberately. Walter was 31. Sallie was 26. James was approaching 2 years old with tremendous confidence in his own opinions. Robert was 8 months old and had recently discovered that if he dropped his spoon from his high chair and looked at his mother with a specific expression, she would pick it up approximately forever, a dynamic she was aware of but found herself unable to entirely resist. The ranch was the most successful it had been since Walter had built it from the ground up. The herd was 350 head, the Abilene contract was solid, and a new arrangement with a cattle buyer in Fort Worth was in negotiation, which Sallie was handling with the precision and firmness that had become her professional signature. On a quiet October evening, with both boys asleep and the house holding the particular piece of children at rest, they sat together on the porch in the cooling air, the first touch of fall working its way through the heat, the stars beginning to emerge, and Walter put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned against him, and they looked out at the grassland and the dark shape of the barn and the far-off line of the north pasture. "Are you happy?" he asked. He asked this with some regularity, not as doubt but as genuine inquiry, because he was a man who did not assume. She considered it as she always did, honestly and without the automatic affirmative that the question often elicited from people who did not want to disappoint the asker. "Yes," she said, genuinely. She was quiet for a moment, the warm weight of him beside her and the night around them enormous and particular to this place. "When I stepped off that stage, I had $11 and a dead fiancé and no idea what would happen next. I was trying not to be afraid. Were you afraid?" "Of course," she said, "but I was more angry than afraid. I did not come all this way to fail." He pressed his lips to her hair. "You have not failed at anything." "We have not failed at anything," she corrected quietly. "That is the point." He held her a little more closely, and the night breathed around them, the distant sound of cattle in the north pasture, and the creek running clear, and the October sky stretched overhead full of stars that she had first looked at from this same porch on her wedding night, with the overwhelming sense that she had, against all odds and practical probability, arrived somewhere true. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "Every day when I come in from the pasture or the barn or wherever the morning has taken me, and I come through that door and you are at the table with the account book or in the garden or talking to Domingo about the fence line, or you are doing whatever it is that you happen to be doing, I am aware, consciously, that this is the thing I would choose above anything else if I could choose again." He paused. "I would choose you. I would choose this." His voice was quiet and even and absolutely certain. She felt the words go through her like light. "I would choose you too," she said, "every day." She meant it with every practical, clear-eyed, unsentimental cell in her body. And that was what made it real, the fact that it was not wishful or romantic in the easy sense, but earned and true and chosen. He kissed her on the temple, a long, warm press of his lips that was more tender than anything dramatic, and she leaned into it and closed her eyes and let the night hold them. Inside the house, Robert made a small sound that resolved itself without requiring attention, and James turned over in his sleep with a thump that was also fine, and the house was quiet again, and the stars were everywhere, and the ranch was theirs, truly and completely, and had been since the moment in the kitchen on that first visit, when she had told him plainly what she wanted, and he had said that seemed like a reasonable thing to want. In the voice of a man who had already decided he would like to be part of making it happen. Spring of 1882 arrived with a particular generosity. The winter had been mild and the rains had come early, and the grassland around Redemption Creek was as green as it ever got, deep and rolling under a sky that seemed cleaner than usual. The cattle were in good condition. The Fort Worth contract had been finalized to Sally's satisfaction at terms she had refused twice before accepting, and the kitchen garden was at peak production, which meant the kitchen itself smelled perpetually of good things. Else Henderson had written from the normal school, a letter of 9 pages that described her courses and her professors and her fellow students with the focused enthusiasm of someone exactly where they are supposed to be. She was excelling, her professors had said, and she had already been asked to assist with instruction in the lower levels, a distinction that was unusual for a first-year student. Sally read the letter twice and then put it in the small wooden box on her writing desk, where she kept the things she wanted to be able to return to. The town had acquired a second church, a hardware store had opened, and a photographer named Mr. Chen had arrived from San Francisco and established a studio, which was a novelty that drew considerable interest. He was a precise, careful man who spoke excellent English and produced photographs of uncommon quality, and Redemption Creek was, on the whole, more welcoming to him than Sally had been prepared to expect, though there were corners of less generosity that she noticed and was not surprised by. Mr. Chen, who had grown up navigating considerably less welcoming environments than a small Texas town, managed with the same kind of quiet competence she recognized from people who had always had to work harder than others for the same standing. She brought him business by recommending him to every family in her acquaintance. On a bright May morning, she brought the boys to his studio and had a photograph made, the first formal photograph she had ever sat for. James stood very straight and serious and still for 30 seconds, which was everything he had in the way of stillness, and Robert sat in her lap and looked at the camera with deep suspicion. The photograph, when it came out, showed 2 small, clear-eyed boys and their mother with her hand settled firmly on James's shoulder, and her expression the particular one that meant she was content and also entirely alert. When Walter saw it, he looked at it for a long time in silence. "I want one with all of us," he said. They went back the following week, all four of them, and Mr. Chen photographed them on the porch of the ranch house, Walter standing with one hand on the porch post and the other hand on Sally's shoulder, Sally seated with Robert in her lap and James standing between them, and the wide Texas sky and the grassland visible behind them. The photograph, when it was ready, caught something in the composition of them that was not manufactured. It was simply what they were, a family built from scratch on good intentions and hard work and love that had arrived neither expected nor requested and had proved itself every day. Sally had it framed. It stood on the mantelpiece in the main room where it would stand for the rest of their lives. In the August of that year, a situation arose that asked something specific of Walter and Sally together, not just practically but morally. A group of Apache people, 3 men and a woman with a young child, had been found camped near the creek that bordered the western edge of the Fletcher property. They were not a threat. They were clearly exhausted, and the child was ill with a fever. But the circumstances they were in told a story that was familiar and deeply unjust. People displaced from their lands by the same expansion that had built Redemption Creek and everything around it, moving through territory they had once known as home, and finding it increasingly fenced and hostile. 2 of Walter's neighbors came to him expecting him to drive them off. Instead, he went to the camp alone and sat at the edge of it with his hat in his hands and his posture clearly open, and communicated through gestures and the few Spanish words that served as a partial bridge that he meant no harm, and that the water and the shade were available to them. He came back to the house and told Sally what he had found. She was in the kitchen. She listened to him describe the sick child and the state of the group and said, without hesitation, "Dr. Mercer should see the child." "The neighbors, I do not care what the neighbors say," she said. "A child is sick." He looked at her with an expression that was not surprise but something warmer than agreement. She went with him to the camp herself, taking the basket she used for herb gathering, carrying clean cloths and the calomel and willow bark tea that served as the practical household medicine she had learned from Maria Henderson. Dr. Mercer came, too, without significant persuasion, because he was a doctor and his inclination ran in the same direction. The child's fever broke the following day. The group stayed near the creek for 4 days, and on the morning of the 5th day they were gone, leaving the camp clean and orderly. Walter's neighbors complained to him about it, and he told them, with the same quiet evenness he used for everything, that he was the one who decided what happened on his land and that he had decided this was fine, and if it troubled them they were welcome to take it up with Sheriff Reardon, who was, incidentally, not going to prioritize it. The neighbors grumbled and let it go. Sally wrote about the experience in her private journal, not for publication, just for the record of it, the way it had felt to do a thing that was simply right, and was made more necessary by the fact that the whole weight of the historical moment pressed against doing it. She wrote about the injustice that sat underneath the whole fabric of what West Texas was, built on displacement and violence that had to be named, and she wrote about the small daily choices that did not undo the large injustice but were not nothing either. She showed it to Walter one evening. He read it slowly and then put it down and looked at the fire in the hearth for a moment. "It should go in the newspaper," he said. She had not thought about that. "People will be angry." "Some will," he said. "Some will not." She sent it to the newspaper editor, a young man named Hargrove who had come from Boston with progressive views and a genuine investment in the quality of his paper. He printed it under her full name, Sallie Fletcher. Several people came to her with discomfort about it. Several more came to her with quiet gratitude. Me Colton printed copies and left them on the saloon bar. Dr. Mercer sent her a note that said simply, "Well said." The fall of 1882 deepened toward winter with a fullness and warmth that Sally had learned to recognize as the specific quality of a life, that is being well lived. James turned 2 in February 1883, and Robert would turn 2 in March, and they were a pair that generated an impressive amount of life and noise, an occasional dairy disaster in the Fletcher household. And Sallie moved through the days of it with a satisfaction that was deep and particular, and nothing at all like the narrowing disappearance she had felt in the cotton factory in Dayton. On a quiet November evening when both boys were in bed and the house was at its most peaceful, Walter came and found her at the writing desk where she was finishing a letter to Else, and sat in the chair across from her and watched her write until she finished and looked up. "I was thinking today about the day you arrived," he said. She set down her pen. "Which part?" "All of it. You with your trunk in the dust. Clyde Burrows looking like a man who had drawn the short straw. And you standing there in the middle of the street looking at the town like you were deciding whether it was worth your time." She laughed. "I was deciding that. And, clearly the verdict was favorable." He smiled, the full open smile that she loved. "I was watching from the livery, before Scout made his entrance. I saw you come down the street before you got to us." She had not known that. "You watched me." "I did," he said simply. "I thought you were the most composed person I had ever seen arrive in this town, which is a thing you could only see if you had been here long enough to watch a lot of people arrive." She leaned her chin on her hand. "And what did you think?" "I thought whoever that woman was, she was not going to have a simple time of it, and she was also not going to fail." He paused. "I thought I very much wanted to know her." "And now you do," she said. "Now I do," he agreed. "Better than anyone in the world, I think." She looked at him across the small, warm room, with the fire going and the sounds of the house around them and the boys asleep and the ranch standing in the Texas night outside, and thought about what it meant to be known, fully and honestly known, by someone who had watched you at your most practical and your most frightened and your most capable and your most uncertain, and had stayed in his chair every single time. "I know you too," she said. "Better than anyone." He reached across and took her hand, and they sat together in the quiet of the evening, with that knowing between them, steady and real and theirs. It is one of the particular gifts of the wild frontier that it strips away the unnecessary with remarkable efficiency. There is no room in a life built from the ground up in hard country for the things that do not matter, the performances and pretensions and careful managed distances that fill the lives of people with more cushion between them and the reality of things. What remains when the unnecessary is gone is what actually is: the quality of a person's presence in a hard moment, the reliability of their word, the capacity for both practical action and genuine tenderness, and the particular warmth of someone who sees you clearly and stays. Walter Fletcher was all of those things. Sallie had known it from the moment he handed her trunk back to her in the dust, and told her she could reclaim her independence once she had eaten, which was both presumptuous and correct, and entirely his character in a single action. She had given her whole life a new beginning in a land that was all beginning and no history, and she had built every part of it herself, with her own hands and her own mind. And the man sitting across from her had been part of it, not as a provider or a savior, but as a partner, a true and honest and fully equal partner, which was the only thing she had ever actually wanted. The December before James's 3rd birthday, Sallie found out she was expecting again, and told Walter over breakfast with the same directness she brought to all important things, and he looked at her across the coffee cups, and the morning light in his expression was the clean open joy that she had first seen on the evening she had told him about James, still exactly that, still entirely genuine, not dulled by familiarity but deepened by it. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am well," she said. "Then I am glad," he said. "So am I." James, when told in age-appropriate terms that there would be a new baby, said very seriously that the baby would need to understand about the horses, and that he would teach it. Walter assured him solemnly that this was an excellent plan. Robert, who was becoming a person of distinct and thoughtful personality, appeared to process the information carefully, and returned to his current object of study, which was a spider in the corner of the kitchen, with the focused interest of someone who has determined that the spider is more immediately interesting than the prospect of a sibling. The new baby came in August of 1883, arrived in the early evening with the kind of speed and efficiency that Sallie privately appreciated given that this was her third, and turned out to be a daughter, which James assessed with a brief frown, and then accepted with the magnanimity of a senior child who has decided the situation is manageable. They named her Clara Me Fletcher, Clara because it meant clear and bright, and it suited her immediately, and Me for Me Colton, who had been Sallie's first genuine friend in Redemption Creek, and who when told of the honor came over to the ranch the following Sunday and held the baby with an expression of such surprised and uncomplicated love that Amos Reardon, who had ridden out with her, had to look at the sky with studied interest for a moment. Clara was from the first a person of strong opinions and clear preferences, dark-eyed and auburn-haired like her mother, and as determined as either parent, a combination that Walter said was probably the most wonderful disaster imaginable. By the time Clara was 3 months old, the 3 children in the house constituted a complete small society with its own politics, alliances, and communication systems, and Sallie navigated all of it with the same organizational competence she brought to the ranch accounts, though the ranch accounts were considerably more predictable. She would not have traded any of it for anything. Else Henderson graduated from the normal school in the spring of 1884 and came home to Redemption Creek as a qualified teacher, taking the position at the school that had been waiting for her since Mr. Abernathy retired the previous autumn. She came to the ranch on the Sunday after she returned, looking the same and entirely different, the same sharpness and directness, but with an authority around her now that belonged to someone who had gone somewhere and become what they were going to be. She sat at Sallie's kitchen table and drank coffee and looked around at the 3 children and the house and the life that had been built here with an expression that was full. "You started this," she said to Sallie. "You did it," Sallie said. "You made it possible." Elle shook her head slightly. "I want to do what you did for me for other students." "Then do it," Sallie said. "That is exactly how this works." Else Fletcher, who was no relation but might as well have been, began teaching in September of 1884 with 28 students, and a dedication that was immediately apparent to every parent in the district. Within a year she had students reading above their grade level, had organized a small lending library with donated books, and had begun to teach evening classes for adults who had missed formal schooling, which brought in German-speaking homesteaders and older residents who had long wanted to improve their reading and writing. Sallie attended the first adult class and sat in the 3rd row with her hands folded and watched Else Henderson teach with a feeling that was very close to pride and very close to love. Walter came to pick her up afterward, and Else walked them to the door, and they all 3 stood on the school steps in the October evening. "This is good work," Walter said to Else simply, which from him was the most meaningful kind of endorsement. Else looked at both of them. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." They drove home through the dark, and Walter held the reins loosely and Sallie leaned against his shoulder, and the stars above West Texas were everything they had always been, enormous and indifferent and strangely comforting in their permanence. "Are you thinking about Ohio?" he asked. He sometimes asked this, not anxiously, just with genuine curiosity about where her mind was. "No," she said honestly. "I have not thought about Ohio in a long time." "Where are you thinking about?" She looked at the dark shape of the land around them, the grassland and the scrub and the hard, clear line of the horizon under the stars. "Here," she said, "just here." He pressed his lips to the top of her head, a gesture she had collected and kept across 5 years of marriage like stones from a river, each one smooth and particular and real. They reached the ranch, and there was a lamp burning in the window where Sam was keeping an eye on the children, and the stone house was solid and warm-looking in the darkness, and the horses in the near pasture were quiet shapes against the night sky. She stepped down from the buggy and stood for a moment in the familiar darkness of the yard, the smell of the land around her, the sound of the creek and the cattle and the night insects, all of it exactly right, exactly as it should be. "Come inside," Walter said beside her. "In a moment," she said. She stood there one more moment, Sallie Fletcher, who had been Sallie Doyle, who had come to this place with nothing but herself and $11 and a stubbornness that refused to consider failure, and looked at the life she had built in the middle of the hard and beautiful and difficult and generous Texas frontier. The ranch, the children, the community, the work that mattered, the man who knew her better than anyone in the world and chose her every day with the same deliberate, honest clarity with which she chose him. It was not perfect. The land was not perfect, and history was not perfect, and people were not perfect, and she had never expected any of those things to be. But it was true, and it was hers, and it was full. She turned and went inside to her family, and the door closed behind her, and the lamp in the window burned warm and steady in the wide Texas night.